Hey guys, what's up? It's Doublezug. So now we're going to talk about level 2 like spell selection stuff. How do you know what to actually cast in a raid or a dungeon or whatever environment? So really to start, we're just going to look at like what our goals are with our casts, right? So the main goals are like obviously your number one is just to prevent people from dying, right? That's a healer, that's your job. But this is like kind of a broad thing, right? There's a million ways to do this. The primary way you're going to do this is just by doing high HPS. You're gonna have your base to parse brain going on here. So usually doing high HPS is like sort of the best way to prevent people from dying in your raid. There's other things too, like there's like marginal utility stuff. There's like emergency healing. Sometimes like preventing death doesn't align with doing high HPS, but like most of the time the heuristic is like if you just do high HPS, you're probably preventing death optimally outside of like using your externals and raid cooldowns and stuff like that. Although when doing high HPS and preventing death don't align, you obviously are going to want to err on the side of preventing death unless you're super parse brained and you don't care about wiping, which is bad, obviously. Don't do that. And then the third thing is like doing damage, right? So there's like preventing death, your utility, your high HPS, and then once you're preventing death, obviously, then you can secondarily do damage. This is pretty much just a retail thing. Like in classic, your healer damage doesn't matter at all, really, unless you're like in some sort of speedrunning guild. And if you're in the like 1 in a million guilds where your healer damage actually matters, you probably already know that. And if you're not in one of those 1 in a million guilds, like just don't worry about this in classic. But in retail, especially M+, right? Like the game is kind of designed around healer damage, which personally I think is like not really the greatest design, but it's the way the game is. So if you do play retail, you do M+, you're gonna want to like tertiarily be doing damage, right? And worrying about like how to do the most HPS so that you can have a bunch of free globals to like press Holy Fire or whatever it is, whatever damage button. Usually as a healer you have like 2 damage buttons, right? Or you go into cat form and just press whatever, like rake, rip. But yeah, this is just a retail thing. Like if you're in classic, don't worry about healer damage pretty much until you're like, a speedrunner or something. So yeah, this is like the basics of our goals, right? Where our primary goal is to prevent death. To do that, we're going to be doing HPS, we're going to be doing our utility, and then tertiarily after we've prevented death, we can do damage. Also, like something to mention first here, usually the game is designed around this basic structure where like the spells that are very good at preventing death are usually balanced around being high in resource usage. So usually that's like mana, but it can also be holy power, stuff like that. My example here is just flash heal. So this is an evergreen example, right? This is in every version of the game. Your flash heal is always going to be designed to be like high HPS and a low cast time, right? So it's like good at saving somebody who's dying, but it's going to be balanced around having a high mana cost and a low like healing per mana. So every flash heal you do is usually going to lower your overall HPS, assuming you're mana limited. So the game is generally balanced around like those high HPS emergency heals being expensive. And the way that this basic design structure works is that you're usually going to be most of the time spinning your wheels with your high HPM spells, and then you're going to want to be like trying to use the minimum amount of your like really expensive emergency heals to prevent death. And balancing that out, most of versions of the game are not balanced around you pressing like your high HPS spell every global unless you're playing Wrath of the Lich King. So yeah, that's like that basic structure of how the game is designed is usually like it's a good starting point, right? And then from there we'll use our other methodologies to actually determine which spells are good in which circumstances. But like usually the game kind of tells you the truth and doesn't lie to you about like a flash heal being an emergency heal and your greater heal being like a pretty good tank heal, and your like heal button being efficient but like very low HPS, and then your cooldown spells are probably going to be used on cooldown and stuff like that. So usually the game doesn't lie to you about those things, but sometimes it does. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So first thing to do is just like read your spells. So you're going to want to open your spell book and just like read through it. So obviously this is like a very like basic baseline simple thing to do, but you'd be surprised how many people, even people like in raiding guilds and stuff who like have played the game a long time and seem like they know what they're doing, just like don't know what their spells do, especially the more marginal spells that you don't really use that much. Like just be familiar with the basic mechanics of how your spells work. This is way easier in classic, honestly, than it is in retail. Retail, there's so many, like, you have so many talents, like there's just a million talents and they all have like unique effects a lot of the time and like weird modifiers, and there's just so many interactions that retail is actually kind of hard to like know what your spells do. At like the actual nitty gritty, like detailed level, but in classic, like most of your talents are just like percent 5% on your heal. Like, and so the basic structure of what your spells do is like pretty obvious just from reading the tooltip. So that can be useful. The basic structure of healers having greater heal, and flash heal is like pretty constant throughout the whole game for the most part. So that's like kind of a basic structure, and usually that relationship holds. And then you have your like cooldown spells that are going to be power and HPM, and you have your cooldowns obviously. So the basic structure of how healers work is like pretty similar across the game, honestly. So once you understand how to heal on one healer, it's usually pretty transferable. But yeah, just read your spells. Like, obviously, this is just a really obvious one. And again, what the game wants you to do isn't always correct, but it's usually a good starting point. So like, you can just sort of intuit from reading your spells, like, oh, flash heal is probably an emergency heal. Oh, like wild growth, that's probably a spell I use when there's raid damage. Like, and that's those assumptions that you're making are usually correct, but sometimes they're not. And so we're going to talk about how to like tell when they're not. Yeah, so example here again, like the 3 heal structure in Kata, flash heal is usually good at preventing death and usually bad at efficiency. The dev's intentions match reality here, except for like Resto Shaman, because Resto Shaman you should never ever cast Healing Surge pretty much, because you always have your like tidal wave procs, and with your tidal wave procs, greater healing wave is like the same cast time but just way more efficient. So this is an example of when like the dev's intentions don't match reality. Like if you didn't know that and you're playing Resto Shaman and you're casting your healing surge in emergencies, like you're just trolling because it's just worse. Like you should just not have that button on your bars at all. And so like heal is usually bad at efficient healing, right? But which is like the dev's intentions don't really match reality, because most of the time heal just like isn't worth casting on most healers other than like HPAL and maybe Resto Druid, right? So there are usually the structure works, but again, sometimes it doesn't. So now we're going to talk about how you actually tell what's good. So now that we've talked about like the basics and the context in which we're going to be evaluating spells and like our goals, we can talk about the actual methods of evaluations. So we're going to talk about here like practical versus theoretical. At like the highest level, the way you do this, if you really like you don't care about theory crafting at all and you just kind of want to skip all this stuff, all this like math and like work and stuff, is you can just like watch a guide and just trust that the person that's making the guide is like knows what they're talking about. You could like go to WoW ahead and read that, right? That's what most people do. And that is like usually sort of correct, right? Especially in Classic where like the specs are kind of simpler and they're easier to theory craft. It's like pretty easy to just do like the very bare minimum. But we're just going to talk about like how you can get higher levels of certainty, and if you're like interested in theory crafting and stuff, how you'd actually do that, right? So there's 2 approaches. There's practical and theoretical. So the practical is like looking at logs, feels crafting, copying good players, which is again like looking at logs, looking at what people are casting, looking through like the replays of fights and just basically one-to-one copying what people are doing, and like rough mathing using info from logs and stuff like that. The highest level of practical is again just like watching a guide, right, and just sort of trusting. But these other like more nitty-gritty things will help you with evaluation. So, and that's like practical, right? So theoretical, what's theoretical is like actually doing the hard math and hard mathing everything out, like simulating with axioms as close to reality as you can make them. So theoretical is like pretty difficult. It's actually kind of easier in Classic. Like on retail, there's again, it's so complicated and there's so many different factors and like everything is, there's like a million interlocking talents and there's like a million different permutations of every talent build and all that stuff. So it's actually way harder to do theory crafting in like theoretical theory crafting in retail, which is why like most retail players just don't do this and they rely on like the world first raiders or like the one guy that does theory crafting to do this, and then they just copy. So it's actually kind of a cool thing about Classic that you can kind of do this yourself because it's simple enough. It's like the difference between like an old car made in the 50s or whatever and a new car. Like you can actually fix an old car because it's like just a carburetor and some tubes. Whereas a new car, everything's like controlled by a computer and insanely complicated and you can't really fix it. So this is kind of a bonus of Classic rather, is that you can kind of do your own theory crafting. So yeah, practical is much easier than theoretical, but unless you do the math, you can't ever really be certain you're right? There's always some level of like trust that the good players are playing correctly, that like the highest logs are actually playing correctly, that whoever guides you watch, they're actually like, they know what they're talking about, that kind of thing. Whereas if you math things out, you can have a higher level of certainty, obviously, unless you're really bad at math. So very few people actually do this kind of like hard mathematical, theoretical theory crafting, especially for Classic, because the game's like kind of simple, it's pretty solved, right? Whereas for retail, like you kind of do need that one giga autist guy who maths out every single possible combination of talents and figures out what's mathematically best so that everyone can copy him. Yeah, there's just less overall theory crafting for healing. One of the big reasons for this is just that like harder to sim and there's like less objective feedback, right? So for DPS, like even for tank damage, right, just a very easy like thing to sim out and find out what's actually mathematically best. There's a lot more people that work on those sims, and there's also like more objective feedback from the game, right? Like your meters just directly tell you when you're doing more damage, and there's not really a way to like cope or get out of that one. Whereas like with healing, there's just a lot more nuance to go into like what the meters mean, and a lot of people will cope and stuff with HPS, and there's just less like very obvious in your face objective feedback for what is best. And like simulation, right, it's like harder. There's just more assumptions you have to make, and it's a more difficult thing to model. So you can't just like ask the robot, right, like you do for DPS, put all your gear, everything, and all your talents, and just see exactly what's mathematically correct. All right, so I'm gonna go through like an actual example. So this is the spreadsheet I did for the recent Resto Druid guide that just came out. This is an example of sort of a mixture of theoretical and practical. Here what I did is I went through a log of like, I believe it was VNT, like a 4-minute and second fight that was like decently high parsing. The reason I chose VNT is just because it's a decent mixture of like some tank damage and some raid damage, and the fight length was, I think, representative of like the average fight length in T11 at this point. This is an example of theoretical and practical because I just went through logs and did like counted casts and calculate mana spent for like Fury versus Moonglow, and as well as like I just took the like average healing from logs to do the calculations for healing per mana and healing per cast time. There, again, you could go like even nittier grittier and do harder math here, where you would like do actual theoretical calculations from like you know, you go to Wowhead or WowWiki or whatever and get all the coefficients and actually do a perfect mathematical model of how much things like heal for objectively, and then assume some overhealing or whatever, and model from like some theoretical BIS list all your secondary stats and all that. But personally, I feel like this is just the best, most time efficient and practical way of doing it. Again, for classic, like this is super simple, right? There's only like 8 spells and 1 healing cooldown and tranquility, and there's like, you know, if I were to do even a basic napkin math analysis of like Resto Druid, for example, on retail, it would take like 40 hours. Like if I was gonna go on the War Within and try to model like all the spells and all the possible permutations and interactions between all the different talents and all the different fight lengths and all that kind of stuff, and it would just take like a million years. So this is, again, one of the things about Classic that's nice is like the specs are actually kind of simple and easy to understand and model and stuff. This is why you need like the Giga Autis for retail, because I'm not going to spend 40 hours in every spec. But I'll spend it, you know, like an hour figuring out Resto Druid for Classic. So yeah, this is just an example of like how you'd actually go about mathing out like what spells actually do. The other thing that's kind of useful to know here is like conditionals for spells. So like how many targets makes wild growth worth, and that's something you can math out as well. Some like really simple examples of this are like Palm. Palm is good at healing ticking raid damage, right? And the way we would look at that is by you could either do the practical analysis of looking at logs and seeing like, oh, Palm does a lot of healing per cast time on these raid damage fights, or you could do the theoretical of saying like, well, if Palm only ticks once, it has X healing per cast, X healing per mana, which is kind of low, but if it bounces 3 times, plus, now it has good healing per cast time and healing per mana. So there's different ways, again, there of evaluating a spell like Palm, and then understanding where you should send each heal. So there's like, you know, basic conditionals like this. Like in Classic, you should never send a direct heal into Beacon if you can help it, because it's going to reduce the healing done by 50% in Kata and 100% in Wrath. You're going to not want to send your Palm where it won't bounce, right? So there's these like conditional things that you're just going to discover either through a practical analysis of logs, just copying a guide writer like myself, or by you know, actually doing the math. Having these conditionals and like what type of damage each spell is good at healing and all that kind of stuff in your brain is going to make your healing way more efficient. Once you know like the efficiencies and the conditions for each spell, you're going to want to have like heuristics for different levels and types of raid damage. So for here, I'm going to use Dispriest and Kata as an example, right? So kind of like 4 different like very basic states of damage. There's low raid damage, high raid damage, low tank damage, and high tank damage. So I just made like an example of like a very quick heuristic set for like Kata Dispriest, where like low raid, you're just going to do Atonement, maybe Palm, Penance, and keep your Rapture on CD. High raid damage, you're going to be pressing POH a lot, you're going to be Holy Firing on CD, you're going to be palming if it's going to tick 4 or 5 times, and again, keeping your Rapture on CD. Low tank damage is, again, just Atonement, Rapture, Penance. High tank damage is going to be Holy Fire, Penance, and then GH or Binding Heal if you have damage on yourself, and then Flash Heal is like an absolute emergency heal, as well as, again, keeping your Rapture on CD. These heuristics are really nice to fall back on. So once you are practiced with your like main throughput heals, you know what they're all good at. You've either done like a practical analysis or a theoretical analysis of like what places they're good in, what kind of target counts, all the conditionals, stuff like that. You can then start to think about your utility buttons. So this is something that's like pretty important that a lot of people neglect, right? Most people let a lot of their, especially healers, right? They let a lot of their cooldowns and their utility spells just sit on cooldown. This is like pretty bad, especially in retail, right? A lot of retail, like M+ and stuff like that, is designed around you using all your utility. Whereas in Classic, if you use your utility, you're like part of the top 1%. And, you know, the game really isn't designed to be only beatable if everybody uses their utility correctly. But like an M+, right, like you kind of just want to be spamming your utility on cooldown and then pair back from that. So, again, you should be looking for opportunities to use externals. You should be looking for opportunities to kick, CC, use stops, etc. Again, more important in retail, obviously. You should be looking for opportunities to talent into abilities that might be valuable in counter-bind counter. So again, this is more of a retail thing where you're going to be talenting into like your maybe dispel or kick or some stop or something like that, some defensive. And again, the most important thing here is just to learn your entire kit, not just your healing kit. So every spell, every utility button, all that stuff you should be learning, and not just like the buttons that heal. I know this is like the most fun thing to do, is just to blast healing and not care and AFK, but you do actually have to be useful, especially in like M+ retail, stuff like that. Although you can have a huge impact in Classic as well if you do use your externals and cooldowns and utility correctly, and like your defensives and stuff like that. Like if you play all that stuff, if you play your defensiveness correctly in Classic, you can like be invulnerable because the game is a lot simpler and easier, and it's designed around people not really using their defensive. So if you do, you become like immortal, which is kind of cool. And then again, so once you've mastered like your throughput and your utility, now you can go on to damage. Again, this is more of a retail thing, but for Classic players, this is basically irrelevant. Healer damage is low, and also damage checks are low, so your main value, if you have extra globals, is, you know, you're much better off in like 99.9% of guilds using those extra globals to just do more HPS and to make things way safer than to actually just do like a tiny bit of damage that doesn't matter anyways. For retail players, it's much more relevant to do damage, especially in M+, but also like in Raid, sometimes in Mythic Raid, right, the damage checks are actually kind of tight. That's more, if you're in a circumstance where your healer damage matters in like Raid on retail, you would already know that because you're going to be in a high level guild or whatever. But again, this is important to learn, right, in M+, like how to actually weave that in, how to know how much healing to do and how much utility globals to use so that you can use the rest of your stuff on damage. And again, the healer damage in Raid too, it's like, because the way that retail works, like a lot of the healing is more like cooldown loaded, right? Like you schedule all your cooldowns and that does like a lot of the work for you. So in between those cooldowns, you're like just maintenance HPS like really isn't that high, and it doesn't require that much attention, so you can do a lot of other things. But like in Classic, again, this stuff doesn't really matter, but it is a useful skill to develop, to learn like how much damage can I do before everybody dies from lack of HPS. And again, don't prioritize this until you're good at healing. So that this like tier list here of like throughput first, then utility, then damage, this applies in every version of the game. And you should be figuring out how to optimize your throughput as your #1 priority, because that's like your main job, right? And then your secondary priority should be utility, and then your third priority should be damage. So you shouldn't prioritize the healer damage until you're good at the other things. Again, nobody dying will increase your DPS, timer and key, and raid success rate, etc. way more than doing a bit more healer damage all the way until the absolute highest level of play on retail. And again, for Classic, there's basically no level of play where healer damage matters at all. So now I just want to end off here with a little discussion of like conditionals. So this is way more relevant for retail because, again, retail is just so much more complex. Like the conditionals that are relevant in Classic, for example, is like maybe there's one per spec where it's like, hey, you know, wild growth you should use on 3+ targets, POH, 3+ targets, POM, you know, you want to use it if it's going to bounce 3 times plus. Like those very, very simple conditionals. There's not a lot of stuff about like on retail, you know, there's like, you know, for Holy Priest, it's like there's a talent that makes your Holy Nova do 500 times more healing if Mercury is in retrograde and Venus is aligned with Mars. You see a good omen in the wind and all the stars align, and you know, you've cast like 50 heals in a row or whatever. Like there's a million different weird little little conditionals and buffs and stuff that will all have to align in order for Holy Nova to randomly be a good spell to press. What I'm gonna mention here is just use like weak auras as much as you possibly can to just automate those conditionals. Again, you're gonna have to like math out whether or not it is actually useful to cast Holy Nova if all the stars align and if you get all those 50 random buffs. And if it is, then you want to be using weak auras as much as you possibly can to automate telling you when it's actually good to press that button. That is only good if like 50 random weird little niche conditionals are met. Also, like the more complicated the conditional is, the more value you get from just automating it. You know, this will require like some weak aura ability to build these, but usually if there's like a random weird conditional that makes a certain button really good to press and it's like bad every other time to press, someone will have built a weak aura on retail to tell you when it's good to press. So this is just something to mention. Again, for Classic, this is really not that important. All the specs are like, they're simple enough to understand that like you don't usually really need that much weak aura automation to play correctly, which I think is a good thing, honestly. But in retail, again, like there's just so many weird talents and modifiers and conditionals that it actually will increase your healing an insane amount. Kind of an unreasonable amount, honestly, to have like really good weak auras and a good UI that will tell you like exactly when it's the right time to press whatever random button. So that's level 2. Again, just overview here. The most important things, just like know what your spells do. Prioritize HPS and preventing death, and then secondarily you're going to prioritize utility and damage. Know all your toolkit, all your utility spells, all your damage buttons, all your healing buttons, know what they do. And then have some strategy to evaluate which spells are good where. The highest level is obviously just going to be reading Wowhead or copying a guide, and then, you know, lower levels is reading logs, and then the absolute most nitty-gritty, you know, ground level thing is going to be like actually mathing everything out and simming. So that's level 2. The next video I'm going to do is going to be about making a plan, and it's going to involve like mana management, and actually I might do a video just describing in a very basic detail how to actually read logs. I know that's most WoW players already know how to do that, but I think it's a useful thing. If you don't know how to do that, it's like gonna multiply your ability to be better hugely to be able to read logs. And then I'm gonna do like mana management and making a plan, obviously. So thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, I guess, if you want to.
Swobu! Zug Zug!